You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio Network. And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
Okay, going to our guest, I have researched a lot of the claims of Michael A. Hoffman, and he was educated at State University, New York College. He's a former reporter for the New York Bureau of the Associated Press and other publications. The author of several books and articles, including the UK-based magazine, 14 Times, and he's moved from New York to Idaho in 1996. He now writes just on a whole host of subjects: the occults, the roots of Freemasonry, white slaves, you name it. We're going to be talking about some of that today with him. But like I said, I read other books by people similar to Mr. Hoffman, and it just turned out being kooky or lies or weird or exaggerated or, you know, just very vitriolic, very tribalistic, very isolated little niches who all fight with other camps that are even very similar to themselves. Just looking at his stuff, I just found that it's very well researched, and that's why even mainstream people that don't like Hoffman have to admit that he's accurate. So that's why we've got him here, because he's serious, and we really appreciate him coming on. Mr. Hoffman, good to have you on with us.
Thank you, Alex. It's good to be here.
There's a lot to talk about today. A subject I've talked about because I've seen it in history books quite a bit, know quite a bit about it, but it seems like I tell the public about it and they think I'm lying. Then I read some of your writings about it on your site and some of the things you recommended, and it was even more pervasive than I thought, and that was white slaves. We never seem to hear about the white slaves. Let's start there, then get into the New World Order, the whole occult system, their twilight language, the things you discovered.
Well, the first thing about white slaves is we need to differentiate between the modern understanding of it and then the frame of reference that I'm dealing with. Most people, when they hear about white slavery, they think you're talking about prostitution. And that's, of course, a valid area of study. We know that the Israelis have a large slave market there for people who have been sexually enslaved, but that's not my bailiwick. What I'm concerned about is the enslavement of whites both in Great Britain and in colonial America. And you're absolutely right. This is an obscure, if not entirely unknown theme in American history. The reasons for that are multifarious, but let's start at the beginning. At the beginning, you had a surplus population in England. Now, just the word surplus is a pejorative because a population of white people should not be any kind of a problem. If you have a large population, you should be able to utilize them, especially in a wealthy country such as Great Britain. But there's no question that the theoreticians of predatory capitalism saw the poor whites as being a surplus. And the question was what to do with them.
Hence Australia, New Zealand, the U.S., Canada.
Yes, but we're going back to prior to the discovery and exploration of Canada and Australia, although Australia would become a white slave dumping ground after the American Revolution succeeded. But prior to that, when you saw the beginning of the Enclosure laws, it started under Henry VIII as he began to take over the monastic lands and the lands that historically had represented the divide between the church and the king. And as he usurped that role for himself, you began to see avarice take hold in Great Britain as it seldom had in its past. And they began roping in and fencing in these large commons, as they were known, where...
Hyper-feudalism. There would be large areas around each town that people communally used, and they upped the feudalism and even took that.
Exactly, because feudalism, the term is also considered to be pejorative, but at least in the sense that the peasant in the Catholic Middle Ages of Great Britain was dressed in his own nice wool clothing. He had a sheep or a few sheep to raise. He had a standard of living that existed without usury and without inflation, and he was able to live a type of a life. once predatory capitalism began to build, and it wasn't a sudden phenomenon, it was gradual, of course, and Henry VIII was himself conflicted about it. But we really see it come on with the victory of what I regard to be the predatory capitalists, which is the rise of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Now, she's a heroine in modern American media and in Europe and in the cinema and so forth, but there's a huge disparity between the documentary record on her and what the media portrays her as by these attractive actresses, and she's supposed to be sort of a free thinker. She was nothing of the kind. But the Enclosure laws really came into force under her, and they would continue to do so successively with each aristocratic regime that came to the fore in Great Britain. And what this meant was you needed a political theory to go along with it, to go along with how we were going to deal with these surplus whites who were being pushed off the land and driven into the cities, largely London. And from that, we can go back as far as Heichlett, who is called a geographer, but that's actually a euphemism for political scientist, and even more than that. But Heichlett is known to be a geographer, and he's the one that
we see them to develop what we call eugenics today, and I'm going to see if you agree with this, and that literally the whole system they built. Then you had the Malthusian view that came a little bit later about everything about the state controlling these horrible, dirty ruffians and exterminating them. Please continue.
Yes, Malthus, Reverend Thomas Malthus is at the turn of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, but you're correct. Malthus was also part of this chain of transmission, because what he was doing was he was saying that population is a problem. Now, what's unusual about that is usually when someone is talking about demographics and an enemy's demographics, they say, well, the enemy has too many people. But for a nation to regard its own people as an enemy, this is largely unprecedented in the West. And here we see a revolutionary break between what Western civilization had originally nurtured under Christianity and what was beginning to emerge with the rise of usury and predatory capitalism.
Now, let me stop you. I want to be clear here. You're not a communist, from what I've read of yourself. You're explaining the different forms of capitalism, a strip mining of the society, a predator class where they feed on the lower population. You're saying this is a period of blooming of that mindset. We then have the Club of Rome 1993 document written by Richard N. Haas, reissued last year by the Council on Foreign Relations publicly. I don't know if you've seen this, Mr. Hoffman, but this is public. He says we must have a unifying order. Terrorism will be one branch and environmentalism the other, for the elite to use it and designate the world population as the enemy, humanity the enemy, with us the managers managing. It's incredible quotes. Have you seen those?
I have not, but what you're describing is basically a symptom, an extreme symptom of the final fulfillment of what I'm talking about in its mid-state of gestation.
Okay, please continue with the history. I appreciate it. Go ahead.
But Thomas Malthus, in the late 18th century, saw the surplus whites as being a problem. Now, he did not advocate birth control because Great Britain at that time was just too Christian, and contraception, as my late colleague Charles Proven pointed out, historically was seen as a form of, as equivalent to sodomy or abortion. So it was literally impossible for a clergyman to advocate contraception. So what he advocated was this complex system of celibacy and bachelorhood, which obviously wasn't going to work. But and that wasn't
and
the
also
point of
crowding people together to and spreading disease.
Yeah, and that's what was happening in London, but also in London from the Elizabethan age onward, the London mob, as it was called, had a revolutionary potential. Great Britain, to its credit, had no standing army, it had no police force, and there was a very thin line that stood between the ruling monarch and the people, and the London mob was an obstreperous and vigorous group of people. At any time, they were capable of overthrowing the government.
And that went back to the Magna Carta.
That went back to the Magna Carta. And so what we began to see was the criminalization of the white population of the major cities of Great Britain and Scotland as well, Scotland coming more to the fore in the 17th century, where you had, now people have asked me, what's the basis of the law here? The law here was ad hoc. The law was to take what we see with the New World Order in the United States today. It's to take one law and misapply it. And where I find the beginnings of white slave law, number one in the enclosures, which drove them out, but the actual weaponization of the enclosures, that law relates to pressing or the press gangs. And once again, our media has dealt with this inadequately. They almost make it romantic. The sailors were forced onto the ships, and then
the
they
press
got
gangs. Well, and I want to be clear about this, because you have scientifically broken down and written about what I organically have recognized. They want to get you on welfare, get you in the psychiatric system, or get you in the criminal justice system, or get you in debt. The form of slavery you're talking about is what the British really invented in a modern sense, would be the debtor's prison, where, and now they're saying under Homeland Security, bad credit, you'll have a bad security rating. This is the new system where they create economic suppression to get control of you and then get you into the system by giving you some type of criminal designation.